I told everyone I've yet to find any VTuber willing to talk about and do video reacts on the subject of classical music. But after spending nearly 2 hours talking about a tweet thread on classical art and architecture, I believe it only natural that a discussion on the subject of classical music, one that is a learning journey or quest for knowledge, is the logical next step in the content that is covered on this stream. It's also a way of being the change I want to see in the world in response to what is just absolute brain rot that has permeated our platforms and culture. But it's something that probably I should not attempt to do alone, and instead get some help from great content creators out there, and also start with some of the legends, including a legendary maestro, one who popularized teaching young people all about classical music. And there's a gentleman by the name of Leonard Bernstein. I don't know if any of you know who Leonard Bernstein was, but quite a prolific conductor and composer. I mean, just a titan of a man, with energy levels that just off the wall. There was a great movie that was released within the past year or so, starring and directed by Bradley Cooper, called Maestro, which was somewhat of a biopic about Bernstein. But well, let's just switch over here. We need to switch over. But I want to show you the essence of who Leonard Bernstein was. Let me open this up real quick. This was a YouTube video that's just... if it'll cooperate with me. Right, now I'm going to pause the music, our stream music here, because we need to do that. This is a clip of Leonard Bernstein conducting, I believe it is, yes. This is archival footage from 1973, so this is over 50 years ago. It's been recently restored. Footage of Leonard Bernstein leading the London Symphony Orchestra in the finale of Gustav Mahler's Second Symphony, with accompaniment by soprano Sheila Armstrong, mezzo-soprano Janet Baker, and the Edinburgh Festival Chorus at Ely Cathedral in Cambridgeshire. Just watch this and listen as well. Let me bring the audio up just a bit more. This is good. You have to see this. You have to hear this, chat. absolutely brilliant. I'm just that performance at Ely Cathedral 50 years ago is regarded as one of the greatest performances of classical music of all time. I mean, you could tell Bernstein put his entire heart and soul, every last bit of energy that he had within him, all of his essence, he put into conducting that orchestra. The London Symphony, one of the best of the best. You have heard them in everything from concerts at the Royal Albert Hall to performances of and recordings of great film soundtracks. I mean, London Symphony Orchestra, they are the ones responsible for the music of Star Wars, the original trilogy. That was them performing, being conducted by John Williams. Mahler's Second Symphony is called the Resurrection Symphony. It's performed in C minor. The imagery in that film that we just saw, there's a reason that the camera panned out from an arch and turned up to sort of do that tracking shot with all of the different images of the life of Christ. Because so often the Resurrection Symphony is associated with the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, all of the stars just came together and were in alignment just right for something that was just so perfect. I mean, it really was just an absolutely perfect performance by everyone involved. And it was a crown jewel of Bernstein's career. This was a man who had helped to popularize the works of Mahler. Him and some other people, other great conductors like Leopold Stokowski. You may remember him from the first Fantasia movie from Disney. Just absolute masterpieces. And Mahler and Bernstein were sort of kindred spirits in a way, because they poured all of their essence into their work. Their work was their life, and their life was their work. There's something rather interesting about Leonard Bernstein that I was looking into earlier this week. Is the young people's concerts that Bernstein did. And not just the young people's concerts, but also the lectures that he gave at Harvard University, which, by the way, if you were fortunate enough to see him in the flesh. But even now, with the videos that survive long after he has passed on, You are getting an absolute masterclass in music and musical theory. I mean, if you're going to learn from someone, you might as well learn from the best. And personally, I would love to learn music from Leonard Bernstein. I am no musician by any stretch. I've got a bit of a musician's ear, but that's probably just from being trained by many years in radio. But I wanted to do something a bit more highbrow, especially for a Sunday. I felt it most appropriate for a Sunday. And so I thought we might do some video reacts to selections from young people's concerts, taking this from the perspective of a young person who's just learning about music. And that's what these were. These were sort of open matinee-style concerts where families with children could come and learn about music. And Bernstein was not only just a maestro in every sense of the word, but he was also a teacher. And he was a damn good teacher at that. But let's just start with something simple. What does music mean? Now there's a philosophical question if I ever heard one. Let's check it out.
Leonard Bernstein was a force of nature. He loved music, and he wanted everyone else to love it too. I'm Whoopi Goldberg, and let me tell you, being around him was an experience because he hugged everyone, and he was brilliant as a musician and as an ambassador for music. Now, television was just a baby in 1958 when Leonard Bernstein started leading the Young People's Concerts, but he knew what television could do. That's why he insisted that these concerts be on television, because he wanted millions of people to see and hear this music, not just a couple of thousand people in the concert hall.
I can just imagine the pushback that he got from that. Because you have to remember at this time, radio was just starting to get some sort of acceptance by high society. Film and television and certain forms of the stage were still regarded as very déclassé, very lowbrow, very low class. But one of the things that the regulators were quite wise to do, especially in the United States and in the beginning of television, was to require that a certain portion of programming has to be in the public service, almost regarding it as like a public utility. And so teaching people about the arts, if they have access to a television set, well, that was regarded as obviously being in the public service. Because television was, and still is, a powerful teaching tool. Bernstein saw that. That's some incredible foresight on his part. Anyway, let's keep going.
And he wanted to explain it to them in such a way that they would go on exploring it and loving it even after the concert was over.
That's how you know he's done his job. If you're so curious that you want to learn more, that you want to keep going, you want to listen to more classical music, you want to learn more about it, and just keep going in that journey, then he's done his job. That's what this is supposed to do, to inspire you to seek more, to ignite your curiosity. We need more of that in this world.
Well, it worked. You would not believe the number of musicians and listeners today who say that Leonard Bernstein and the Young People's Concerts introduced them to music. And it was certainly true of me. So, Let's look past the black and white pictures and the clothes and the hairstyles that make these programs look a little strange and a little antique and hear what Leonard Bernstein and his orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, have to say about music and what it means. Because Leonard Bernstein did this better than anyone.
Well, I think we're all capable of looking past the vintage look and the black and white imagery. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of you would rather find that rather cool. I know I do.
For instance, if I play a note on the piano, just one note, and I hold it a long time, that has no meaning at all, has it? But let's say I play the note and then I move to another note. Right away there's a meaning we can't name, a sort of stretch, a pulling, a pushing, something like that, but it's there. And the meaning is in the way those two notes move, and it makes something happen inside of you. If I move from that first note to another note, like this, the meaning changes. Something else happens inside of you. The stretch is bigger somehow and stronger. Now this note, for instance, means one thing with this chord under it. And it makes you feel a certain way. And it means something completely different with this chord under it. And it makes you feel another way. Then with this chord under it, it means something else. Or with this chord. And each way, each different chord makes you feel a different way. Now, what about these notes? Do you know what these notes are? What's that? Right, okay.
That's the, for those of you who don't know, those are the chords for the theme to Dragnet, which was an old police procedural on television and also on radio back in the 1950s and into the 1960s. It starred Jack Webb as Detective Joe Friday, and normally if you hear dun, 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 then that was the sound of, oh dear, the police are coming. You better hope that you're not doing anything wrong, because otherwise they're going to get their man.
Well, now they mean something exciting and spooky is going to happen, like Dragnet. But if I take the same notes and just play them in a different way, they'll mean something else. Silly. It just...
That almost sounds like a saloon. We're taking Dragnet back in time to the days of the Wild Wild West, you know? Detective Joe Friday is more like Marshal Joe Friday, and teaming up with Marshal Dillon to bring law to the lawless Wild West.
Light and silly, and they're the same notes. So you see, the meaning of music is in music. It's in the melodies and the rhythms and the harmonies and the way it's orchestrated. And most important of all, in the way it develops itself. But that's a whole other program. We'll talk about that some other time. Right now, all you have to know is that music has its own meanings right there for you to find inside the music itself. And you don't need any stories or any pictures to tell you what it is. If you like music at all, you'll find out the meanings for yourselves just by listening to it.
Quite right. I mean, we think about music, and that's, what is it? It's an emotional response. I mean, that finale to Mahler's Second that we heard earlier, there was such power and majesty to all of it, and you know, even listening to it myself a few times this week, I found myself being rather emotionally moved by that. Even getting a bit misty-eyed. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit it brought a tear to my eye. Because it really is rare. You almost have to go back to the Baroque era to find, or to certain composers in the Romantic era, to find classical works that really just seem to embody the glory of God. That's hard to pull off. And I think Mahler was one of the last people in recent history to do something like that. Oh, here's a more fundamental question. What is classical music?
What is classical music? Well, it turns out to be a very misused term. In this concert, Bernstein ends up answering a different question and takes a quick but comprehensive romp through music history in the process. By the end, you'll know the difference between Bach and Brahms, and you'll understand that writing a fugue is like building a Ferris wheel. That's a typical kind of Bernstein connection.
And there's a lot of moving parts that go into a fugue. A fugue, for those of you who don't know, for those of you who may not be trained in any sort of music theory, a fugue is basically overlapping melodies. Like, you think of like Bach's Toccata Fugue in D minor, especially once they get to the fugue portion. You'll hear it. It's multiple overlapping melodies that just sort of build on each other, layer, 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 and sort of weave throughout that portion of the work to the very end.
Makes perfect sense. By the way, he wrote all the scripts for these concerts himself and chose the music. The concerts were recorded live. On Saturday mornings, Bernstein would have a rehearsal with the orchestra at 8 a.m., a dress rehearsal at 10 a.m., and the concert was at noon. Talk about a tough schedule. And there's another bit of...
Normally you're rehearsing for like at least a week or two before you do anything like that. That is a very tight schedule.
Of musical history that you may have noticed already. Along with the strange glasses on the musicians, you have probably noticed that other than a harpist who shows up occasionally, you don't see any women in this orchestra.
No, that was also another thing. The idea of women being a part of a symphony orchestra is a fairly recent phenomenon. Most of their roles were confined to, as Whoopi Goldberg says here, as harpists. You can even go and watch the original Fantasia, which was a film made about 10, 20 years earlier. It was released in 1940. And you'll notice with the footage of the orchestra, they're all men. The only women are the harpists. Everyone else is a man. And the idea of women being anything other than a harpist, or something to that effect, there was a lot of like extreme conservatism, at least by our standards back then. There was a negative reaction to the idea of more women being in these positions. I know that Leopold Stokowski, he wanted more women in these positions, and it wasn't to do with any sort of quota. It wasn't to do with any sort of social justice nonsense or anything like that. It was because men like Bernstein and Stokowski saw tremendous raw talent in a lot of female musicians. And for that, the establishment in classical music and in the music scene, they oftentimes would just attack them relentlessly. I know that Stokowski, in particular, during his lifetime, received a lot of criticism, and some of it, not so obvious, but done in a way to sort of disparage him and his character, because of the simple fact that he wanted more female musicians. And the establishment within certain spheres of influence in the music scene, they did not want that. They wanted this to be a protected boys' club. But men like Stokowski said, no, we've got extremely talented female musicians here that would be a wonderful addition to our orchestras. We should give them a chance. Again, not trying to set up a quota system, not trying to not trying to push some sort of agenda. It was strictly a content of character and a matter of raw talent. They just saw good, raw talent in musicians that happen to be female. But there was still a bit of a glass ceiling to be broken through back in the 40s and then the 50s, as we'll see here.
There were no full-time women players in it before 1966. That was probably a function of the times, and I'm glad to report that those times have changed. There are lots of women in today's New York Philharmonic and in most other orchestras around the world as well. Not to take away anything from the guys of a few decades ago. I'm sure you'll agree that they played very, 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 very well. But it's always good to have a woman in the orchestra.
I mean, if they're good, they're good.
Now,
let them in.
The two giant musical names of these first 50 years of the 18th century were Bach and Handel. Especially Bach, because he took all the rules that the composers who lived before him had been experimenting with and fiddling with, and he made those rules as perfect as a human being can make them. For instance, take that form called the fugue. Now, the rules of a fugue are something like the printed directions you get when you buy an erector set. They tell you exactly how to build a house or a fire truck or a Ferris wheel.
Those of you who don't know what an erector set is, it is a series of metal panels and nuts and bolts that you put together following a set of instructions, as Bernstein said, and that eventually forms something resembling a fire truck or a house or whatever. Think of it almost like a Lego set, except it's all metal.
You start a Ferris wheel by attaching one metal section to another on the floor. Then you add one exactly 4 notches higher, and then another 5 notches higher than that, and so on. Then you make the wheel that goes around the whole construction. Well, now, that's just what Bach does in a fugue. Take this one, for instance, from his 4th Brandenburg Concerto. He lays the foundation for his Ferris wheel by starting with the viola. Now, that's the first section. Then he adds the second section by a violin, exactly 4 notches higher, which means, in musical terms, 4 notes higher and 4 bars later. Now the third piece is attached by another violin 5 notches higher.
Just gets higher and higher and higher as you go along.
And the fourth piece by the cello and the bass way down underneath. And finally, the fifth piece is put into place by the flute way up on top. Now the foundation is built, and Bach can start surrounding it with his wheel. Now, the wonderful thing about that foundation is that it's not just 5 separate bits, one at a time. They're all joined together, which means that whenever a new instrument is added, the others still go on playing something else. So that by the time the fifth piece is attached, by the flute, you have 5 different parts all going at once, just as the 5 different pieces of the erector set are all joined together at once. Now listen.
Overlapping melodies, just like we said. I also have to think how much of a benefit this is, not just to the audience that at, I believe this is at Carnegie Hall, people young and old, men and women alike, learning about all of this. But you also have to think about the gentlemen in the New York Philharmonic here, who are hearing all of this. And I mean, a lot of these old boys, they've been around the block. They know what they're doing. They've got years of practice doing this sort of thing. And yet, I can't help but think of the American football coach Vince Lombardi and his approach coaching the Green Bay Packers every year he would go back to basics. He noticed there was a problem with his team, that they were just having these cock-ups in the middle of their football season that were sort of unforced errors, almost like rookie mistakes that you would not expect from veteran players. And so he decided one day to just go back to the basics with all those lads. And he started out with, "Gentlemen, this is a football." And from there, built up from the basics and just had them do all this stuff over and over again, because sometimes a bit of remedial learning on the basics is necessary. So I tend to imagine that there's some benefit for all these blokes here to get out of all of this. They are going back to basics, hearing Maestro Bernstein going on about, what is classical music and what are the basic elements of a fugue. This has got to be helpful for them as well, I can imagine. And I can also imagine that this made them even better musicians as a result. Because sometimes, yes, you can forget the basics. Sometimes you do need some remedial learning. And it just helps to have a refresher from time to time. So this is something that, when you think about it, it really benefited everyone. The people in the audience, who some of them had no idea about the fundamentals of classical music, or some of them knew a bit about it, but it had been years since they'd been in a music class. And then everybody in the orchestra pit, who knew this stuff by heart, who could play all of this music in their sleep practically. It still helps to reinforce their craft, their trade. Just learning about the basics. Anyways, enough tangenting. Let's go on.
To it all together. Isn't that marvelous? You see, that's classical
Beautiful.
Perfection.
Yes. No, that was brilliant. Let's see, that was January 24th, 1959. Originally broadcast on the CBS television network in the United States. Amazing. Here's a good one. What is orchestration?
An orchestra is a big playground for composers and conductors. And Leonard Bernstein is going to take us on a tour of it. In this concert, the great thing about his tour is that he starts where most other people would finish. The trick, as he explains it, is to pick the right instruments in the right combinations to get the effect you want, rather than getting a big mess. Now, on stage, all of the instruments are supposed to get along nicely. They're not supposed to drown each other out. That's why you need 35 violins to balance a couple of trombones. I'm going to use that in my work.
In theory, that's how it's supposed to work. Sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way. And that, I believe, is the importance of having a good conductor who can sort of spot those issues and say, oi, 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 horns, you're coming in a bit loud, you're drowning out everybody else. Let's soften that up a bit. Very good. Okay, once more from the top.
Now, that's pretty hard to do. Because just think what a composer has to know before he can orchestrate a piece he's written. First, he has to understand how to handle each instrument separately. He has to know what it can do and what it can't do, what its lowest note is and what its highest note is, what its good notes are and its not so good notes, and all the different kinds of sounds it can make. Then, on top of that, he has to understand how to handle all kinds of different instruments together, to blend them and balance them and mix them. He has to be careful that some instruments, which are bigger and louder, like the trombone, don't drown out the littler, softer instruments like the flute. You see, that's easy to drown out. Then he has to be careful that the percussion section doesn't drown out the strings, for example. See, that would be very easy to drown out. Then he has to be careful about mixing the instruments so that they don't get all muddied up together and all kinds of problems like that.
And it's even more complicated with modern sound engineering and modern recordings of an orchestra, or, you know, be it a symphony orchestra, a philharmonic, or just a session orchestra. Because then the engineers working in the background have also got to do their part to make sure that all of these channels are kept reasonably separate from each other and not overlapping too much with one another, and mix that just right to where the finished product on a piece of recorded media, be it a vinyl record, a compact cassette tape, a compact disc, or even just a FLAC file or an MP3, a WAV file, that it still sounds good. You know, there's plenty of live performances that have been captured on microphone. They sound great in person, but then the microphones weren't placed right, or the levels were off, or, you know, it wasn't mixed properly, and so the recorded version sounds like shit. And then you've also got studio productions where they have an orchestra. They're in a recording studio, big, huge soundproof room. Certain instruments, you know, percussion and whatnot, are sort of cordoned off from the rest to keep from drowning out. Same thing with vocals, perhaps. They might be in their own separate booth altogether. And again, if it's not mixed right, if something's a bit too loud or not loud enough, something's going to be off. It's not going to sound right, and people aren't going to like it. And people can be quite unforgiving about that sort of thing. They can forgive poor visuals, but they are not so willing to forgive poor sound. Something that assaults the ear like that tends to trigger a visceral reaction in a lot of people.
The biggest problem he has is to choose, the problem of choice. Imagine yourself sitting down to orchestrate a piece you've written, and there are 107 instruments sitting there waiting for you to decide who should play when and what. You know how hard it is sometimes to decide something like, what would I rather have for Christmas, a pair of skates or a bicycle or whatever it is? Sometimes it takes you days or weeks to make up your mind. Well, imagine how hard it is for a composer to make up his mind and choose not between two things, like a pair of skates and a bicycle, but among all those instruments, to say nothing of the hundreds and millions of possible combinations of those instruments.
It's not just combinations of instruments. Sometimes, with certain composers, they never get the opportunity to make that decision. That opportunity never comes. Modest Mussorgsky is one that springs to mind. You may remember him as the composer for A Night on Bald Mountain, for Pictures in an Exhibition. Pictures at an Exhibition in particular was one that he composed on the piano and did not live long enough to see it be orchestrated. Instead, it was some of his contemporaries and colleagues that had to do it for him. Ravel has one of the most widely circulated orchestrations that is performed by orchestras all around the world. And most often, if you listen to it, like say on Spotify, for example, you will probably be listening to the Ravel orchestration. Ravel being famous for performing, for composing the piece known as Bolero. You know, da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. There are other orchestrations, though. There was actually one that was created by Leopold Stokowski. Gosh, I'm trying to remember when he did that one. It may have been in the 1930s, maybe. Or it could have been as early as the 1920s. I can't remember. I know it had a much more lush, almost film-like approach to it. If not conducted properly, and if the orchestra is not in proper sync with each other, it can become a bit of a cacophonous mess towards the end. And I have heard certain re-recordings by other orchestras, led by other conductors, that they tried as hard as they could, but they just could not really hold it together all that well. But as you go back and you listen to the Stokowski conducting his own orchestration, and that is precision, that is discipline, that is an almost controlled sense of chaos, especially to the finale of Pictures in an Exhibition, which is the Great Gate of Kiev. That one can be hard to kind of hold together. And so it takes the discipline of a good conductor, but also the discipline of the members of the orchestra to keep all of that from degenerating into, as I said, a cacophonous mess. And then there's another one, an orchestration by Douglas Gamley. Gamley being, I believe he was a composer for a lot of Hollywood motion pictures. Then he had a chance to record an album of classical music. And so he decided to take his own approach to scoring of the Great Gate of Kiev, not as part of the entire Pictures in an Exhibition suite, but rather just on its own. And so he came up with this interesting intro with a lot of percussion, very low, and you hear chimes. And then all of a sudden, the orchestra just starts up in a bum, 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 bum. And he had, gosh, I can't remember the orchestra that he did it with, but he had the Ambrosia Singers as part of a choral portion, which I don't think that was part of the original composition by Mussorgsky. Hello there, just doing some yard work, but I'm here. Welcome, Rosso. Welcome. I don't think that was part of the original composition, but it was added in by Gamley, and that's what happens sometimes with orchestration, is that they take a few liberties here and there. But it worked, and it was rather haunting as well. You know, they sort of repeated a few lines before moving on to the next little bit, and it just, I don't think we can play it here because it would it would get a copyright strike. But this is it sounds absolutely marvelous. Personally, I should love to see someone take the Stokowski and Gamley orchestrations and sort of combine them into one, because both of them have these wonderful elements that I think are rather they're missing from the Ravel orchestration. Ravel is very, I don't know, especially the way it's performed, it just seems so almost clinical and procedural, and just it lacks a lot of dramatic oomph that the Stokowski and Gamley performances tend to have. You know, there are times in Stokowski's orchestration of Pictures in an Exhibition that it almost sounds like this horror movie, an old horror movie, you know, an old black and white horror movie. There's portions that they'll give you chills. It almost establishes this feeling of terror. Other portions that just are so emotional and just rather sad. Yeah, there's a lot more emotion in those particular orchestrations compared to Ravel's take on Mussorgsky. Let's see, what else do we have here from Maestro Bernstein? What is a concerto? Very fundamental question, isn't it?
This program is close to my heart because, of course, I'm a concert violinist and I play a lot of concertos. I played my first one by Bach when I was 6. You'll get to hear a movement from one of my favorites, the Mendelssohn Concerto, in this concert. I played the Mendelssohn for the first time when I was 12. It's often one of the first concertos that kids play, but it's a big one for adult violinists too because it's so beautifully written for the instrument, and you find more and more in it as you grow older. I'm sure that's why Leonard Bernstein chose it. I still play it a lot, and I've even written my own cadenza for it. But one lonely violinist standing up in front of the orchestra is just one kind of concerto, as Bernstein explains in this concert. He takes the whole idea back to the beginning, and even takes on the soloist's role himself. In many of the young people's concerts, Bernstein gives examples at the piano, but this time he actually conducts while playing the harpsichord. It's quite a feat, though musicians in earlier centuries did it all the time.
Yeah, that's actually quite rare these days. Usually you've got one person on the piano or harpsichord and one person conducting the orchestra. When they were able to do both at the same time, I can imagine that the orchestra size was a lot smaller. But yeah, nowadays orchestras are about approximately 100 pieces or more. They're massive organizations. They're very large, and so that many artists to manage can be, well, it can be like herding cats sometimes, can't it? So yeah, they could probably do more than one thing at the same time because there was fewer people to manage. Not only that, but probably didn't have the resources to go out and pay somebody to do one thing, pay somebody to do something else.
I think I'll stick to the violin.
Yes.
But a great composer writes concertos that can show off the soloist beautifully and can also be great music at the same time. Now, at the risk of turning this program into a violin festival, we're going to play you an example of a great violin concerto by Mendelssohn. We're going to play you the last movement. Now, here at last
Concerto in E minor.
The virtuoso star in all his solitary splendor in the person of John Corigliano, who's been working very hard today. What you will hear is music that makes a perfect combination of the violinistic element, the flash and all the rest, and serious great music. The orchestra, as you see, is by now practically full size, and they have much more interesting things to do than simply accompanying the big shot. But then the soloist has such difficult, fancy things to do himself that it evens out the balance. So here's the climax of our Corigliano Festival, the last movement of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto.
Takes me back to my days in elementary school when I played the violin. And yes, I did play the violin back in my primary school days. Incredible speed. This makes me want to pick up the violin again. Almost. I think I will, I think it's safe to say I will leave that in the hands of the experts. But anyways, that is just a bit of a taste of who Leonard Bernstein is. Oh yes, by the way, those of you who may be fans of the musical West Side Story, yeah, that was Leonard Bernstein who composed that. Incredible, isn't it? Man who conducted the New York Philharmonic for many years, who was responsible for some of the greatest recordings of classical music in the 20th century. He also composed Broadway musicals. I want to go back to the second piece, the Second Symphony by Mahler. There's a couple of really good videos I found about it. This is a good one, Inside the Score, asking why listen to Mahler. And it tells a fascinating story about the life of Gustav Mahler. Let's take a look.
Gustav Mahler wrote some of the most intense, powerful, and large-scale symphonies in all of music history. This moment from his Second Symphony is like experiencing the Big Bang, an explosion of incredible force that gives birth to a spring of new musical life. It's as though dawn is...
But enough about Gustav Holst and the planets. Two Gustavs here, and we're talking about Mahler, not Holst.
rising on a new world of musical thought. It was Mahler himself who said, "A symphony must be like the world. It must embrace everything." And if anyone could write a symphony of planetary proportions, it was Gustav Mahler. Throughout his career, Mahler pushed all kinds of musical qualities to their max. Emotional expression, the length of his works, the massive size of his orchestras, the sheer loudness and quietness of his music, his use of tonality and dissonance, his motivicism, all these musical qualities were pushed towards their absolute limits. And yet, that's only a small part of the whole story. So I want to tell you why you should listen to Gustav Mahler and how his music could change your life.
He was the title, he was.
At the beginning.
That's a good place to start.
The first symphony begins with the orchestra holding the note A over a range 7 octaves deep. It creates this bottomless well of sound, from which emerges birdsong and distant fanfares. And then finally, the dawn of spring. Mahler was born in 1860 in Czechia.
I hear some of this in the background, and I think of all of these legendary and even epic scores for Hollywood movies. And then I also think that this is where they got it from. And for some of the great composers from like the golden age of Hollywood, that's not too far off the mark, because some of them were contemporaries and colleagues of a lot of famous 19th and 20th century classical composers. I'm trying to remember who all they might have worked with. This one in particular, I think his last name was Steiner. There was also Alfred Newman. I'm trying to remember who all they worked with. Some of them, I think, worked with like Richard Strauss. A few of them, I know some of them were influenced by Wagner. Though I don't think, yeah, Wagner, I think he died before motion pictures really became a thing. But some of them may possibly have been influenced by him. Though given some of the problematic associations between Wagner and anti-Semitism, a lot of them are rather reluctant to even admit that sort of thing. I don't know. That's a rabbit hole I would love to go down to find out which composers of classical music influenced which composers of Hollywood film scores. We'll have to go down that rabbit hole another time. Let's keep going with this.
To a Jewish family. He actually enjoyed great success in life, not as a composer, but as a conductor. He was arguably one of the most prolific conductors of his time, and enjoyed a career of relative superstardom, holding major conducting posts in Prague, Leipzig, Budapest, Hamburg, Vienna, and in the final years of his life, New York City. It was maybe through his conducting
incredible
that he learned
orchestras
to write
there,
for
all of
orchestra
them,
with this fresh, modern sound that we already hear in his first symphony. Here is the dawn of something new, a sonic soundscape which would have a huge influence over future composers. And yet, his childhood was not so glittering. He was the second of 14 children, but 8 of his siblings died in childhood. He grew up.
Sadly, that was more common than we realize. The idea of safe childbirths, where a woman's life is not in danger, is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in modern medicine. As far as like the first half of the 20th century, it was still quite the risk for women to die in childbirth, for a variety of different complications. But this is why you see rather large families, because not only is there risk to the mother and her health, but public health wasn't so great back in those days, and so not uncommon for several of your siblings to pass away. And yeah, so sort of had to keep doing the deed in order to keep having children replace those that might be lost. It's a rather cold and clinical way of putting it, but the reality is no less true.
Up in a house rife with domestic abuse. One story, documented by Sigmund Freud, tells of how Mahler, unable to stand his parents' violent arguments, ran out into the streets, where he was confronted by noisy street groups, military bands, and performers playing silly nursery songs. Overwhelmed by the clashing of music and his high emotions, he fainted in the streets.
Dear Lord. I can't imagine what that must be like. That sort of sensory overload. You know, we have so much high levels of consciousness and awareness now of, you know, people who are neurodivergent, who are quite easily overwhelmed by that sort of thing. Back then, they had no concept of that, except to, you know, say that is overwhelmed by high emotions and fainted as a result because they were just, you know, whipped up into histrionics. But also, the whole reference, I believe that Mahler and Sigmund Freud knew each other, if I'm not mistaken. Well, yeah, think of that. It's like, oh yeah, Mahler is just talking to his good friend Sigmund Freud the other day about his childhood and blah blah blah, and is, you know, talking about this memory of his that he was running out into the streets, and there was all this cacophony of noise from groups and bands and, you know, nursery songs, and everything was just, you know, clashing together, and emotions were running high, and he fainted as a result. It's just like, you know, to us, these names of people who are larger than life, we almost can't seem to fathom that sort of thing nowadays.
We can often hear this psychological trauma in his music, how moments of high emotional intensity are suddenly interrupted by grotesque or vulgar outbursts of brass bands or street songs.
And perhaps it was Mahler's way of dealing with this psychological trauma, because Lord knows they didn't have any medications or therapies or anything like that to deal with this. He poured everything into his work, into his compositions. Which then again, that may still be the just the ticket for a lot of people these days, rather than medication and intense psychotherapy and all like that. Not that there's not a need for that still. Certainly it has its place, but I think we can see now the benefit of art therapy, which from the sound of it is exactly what Mahler spent most of his life doing, was art therapy, putting all of his trauma into his music, and sort of building his life's work around that. All because the poor little boy version of Gustav was in an abusive home and just wanted to get away from all of that, and in his quest to escape, with a fight or flight response choosing flight, he only becomes surrounded by something that is an assault on his senses, and is so overwhelming that it causes a little boy to faint. What an interesting analysis one could do of the life and the mind of Gustav Mahler. That's just incredible.
Even in his first symphony, we can hear his inner conflict, the adult reflecting on his childhood. We hear an emotional strain of street song, suddenly cut off by Jewish klezmer music. And all of this underpinned by a grotesque, minor key version of a well-known nursery rhyme. But the extraordinary thing about Mahler's...
Frère Jacques. Done by solo double bass.
Early symphonies is how they are not only music, they manage to express some kind of world philosophy, some way of looking at or experiencing the world. His second symphony is known as the Resurrection Symphony. This is one of his most popular works, and it often has a profound effect on people who listen to it. I've actually devoted a whole podcast episode to diving deep into this symphony, and I also talk about it in my free program on where
Discovering Classical Music. Go find that on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast chat. It's worth your time. Having watched through this video briefly, just to see if it was something I wanted to cover on stream. Yeah, this guy's good. So go subscribe to his podcast. Go support him. This is good stuff.
To start with classical music. If there's one piece of Mahler you should definitely experience in your lifetime, it should be this one. And that's...
It's Mahler's Symphony No. 2, Resurrection. Also available on Spotify or wherever you get your music. Several great performances. I believe the Bernstein performance at Ely Cathedral with the London Symphony is available somewhere on Spot. Actually, you know what? Let me look at that. Okay. I've got to look this up, chat. This is going to bother me if I don't look it up. Let's see. Mahler Symphony 2. Bernstein. There's at least one or two performances by the New York Philharmonic. I'm having a hard time finding the... Is this it? No, that's the New York Philharmonic as well. Okay, well, you can find performances by the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Leonard Bernstein. Let me see if... No, that's with the Wiener Philharmoniker and Gilbert Kaplan. Where is it? I know they've got to have it somewhere. I believe it's Deutsche Grammophon Records that has the that holds the rights to that particular one. So they released it under their label. I have to look it up, but it's there. I know the video's available somewhere. I think Carnegie Hall has some sort of subscription-based service. It's not too expensive. I think it's no worse than like Crunchyroll, Netflix, Retro Crush, or something like that. You know, so it's like $5, $10 a month or something like that. And it's, I don't know. To me, I think it's worth it just to go watch that film. And it would be one of those that I would gladly download from like Google Play or iTunes or something like that to just have the audio version in my permanent collection of music. Or even to see if you can go get a compact disc of it. And then just rip it to your phone. But anyways, Mahler's Symphony No. 2, Resurrection. Listen to the whole thing. It's... God almighty, how long is that thing? I want to say it's about as long as the... Yeah, that is a long one. To give you a sense of perspective, it fills 2 compact discs, chat. That is nearly 90 minutes worth of music. So the entire symphony is about 90 minutes long. I mean, if you're used to seeing some long-form programming, then it might not be so bad. 90 minutes, that's a fairly short feature film. And worst comes to worst, you could just keep it on in the background when you're working or whatever. But yeah, this is one of those pieces that you absolutely have to... Almost like things that you have to experience before you die. Same could be said of Mahler's Second Symphony.
That's the thing. This music is meant to be experienced, not just overheard. Mahler takes us on a journey from death in the first movement through to resurrection in the finale. The finale alone is devastatingly powerful. After some of the largest scale orchestral writing to have ever been composed, we hear the entry of a chorus, at first very hushed, with the words, "Rise again." Yes, you will rise again. What you have longed for is yours. And it goes on. Oh, believe, you are not born in vain. You have not lived and suffered for nothing. What has come into being must go. What is gone will rise again. With wings that I have gained, I shall rise. Over the course of 15 amazing minutes,
beautiful.
The music and text increase in intensity until the final, astonishing climax. This is not simply a religious symphony. In fact, Mahler was a lifelong agnostic. This is a philosophical work, a way of experiencing the world. And it does need to be experienced for its incredible force of musical power, if for nothing else. The Third Symphony presents another philosophy where Mahler explores the hierarchy of existence, the world, humankind, and eternal love. The order of movements lays out this hierarchy from what the flowers in the meadow tell me, to what the animals in the forest tell me, then what mankind tells me, what the angels tell me, and finally, perhaps most importantly for Mahler's philosophy, what love tells me. This symphony ends here, not with a bang, but with a beautiful, emotionally rich, slow movement, an opportunity for deeper reflection into the nature of humankind and love. In 1895, Mahler's brother Otto committed suicide, an event which is said to have greatly affected Gustav's art and outlook on life. His Fourth Symphony, while smaller in scale, continues Mahler's meditations on life after death. The final movement, titled The Heavenly Life, explores a child's perspective on how heaven should be. However, there seems to be some naive irony in this music. We hear the child describe heaven, but we never quite feel that we belong within it. These first 4 symphonies...
I suppose that's easier than you think to understand, because... we are mortals. We don't belong in heaven, or we're not quite ready for heaven yet. It's not something that mere mortals could understand. But rather as heavenly or supernatural beings, or as souls that have departed the body, that's something that only the human soul can eventually come to understand.
are all programmatic. They all explore narratives or clear philosophical ideas. But although they are now loved by modern audiences, most of Mahler's music was not taken seriously in his lifetime.
Isn't that how it always is for great artists? They're never understood in their lifetime. It only is after their death that people finally begin to have an appreciation for or understand.
He wasn't recognized as a successful composer. With mostly disastrous premieres and poor reviews, his music was often mocked, criticized, and belittled by audience members, other composers, and the press. His conducting career was also berated, partly because of his Jewish background. The anti-Semitic press would constantly harass him and make fun of him, with cartoons mocking his looks and gestures. This cultural anti-Semitism was such a problem that Mahler eventually converted to Catholicism in 1897 in order to secure a top job in Vienna, which he simply wouldn't have been allowed to take on as a Jew. Even there, after conversion, anti-Semitism followed him. The mayor of Vienna even said, "I myself decide who is a Jew and who isn't." And so, Mahler's life was filled with these inner conflicts. Conflicts which you can absolutely hear in his music if you listen closely. Was he a conductor or a composer? Jewish or Catholic? A progressive or a nostalgic? A city dweller or a country lover? In spite of these challenges, there was a line.
It's fairly hard to be both Jewish and Catholic. I can understand the conflict there. But as far as conductor, composer, progressive, nostalgic, city dweller, country lover, you can be both. You can have certain progressive views, but also have a touch of nostalgia and respect and reverence for the past. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can be a conductor, and you can also be a composer. Or a composer that happens to also be a conductor. You can have both a love of the country, whilst also enjoying the conveniences and the modernity of the city. There's benefits and beauty to both. And perhaps that was the great struggle of Mahler's life, was seeking balance. Maybe that was fundamentally what he struggled with, was a sense of balance in his life.
Light of happiness around the corner. In 1901, Gustav met Alma Schindler, who was herself a talented musician and budding composer. He quickly fell in love with her and they engaged in a rapid courtship. And if I'm focusing a lot on Mahler's biography, it's because so much of Mahler's music is so personal, so introspective that understanding his life seems essential if we want to understand his music.
You can't really separate the two. Isn't that... I would think that that is true of most, if not all, great artists out there, that it's difficult to separate the artist from the work because the influences are there. You can't really escape them now, can you?
After meeting Alma, Mahler soon composed his famous Adagietto, which was later included in his Fifth Symphony. He is said to have sent it to Alma as a letter of love, no words, just music, which he knew she would understand.
That's a pretty Chad move, I must say. It's like, yes, darling, I'm going to write you a letter, but it's not going to have any words in it. Instead, I have composed an Adagietto for orchestra for you. Here it is. You've heard of people writing poems for loved ones, perhaps even composing a song and singing it to someone they love. This man took the Giga Chad move and composed a movement for a symphony for his wife, or for his soon-to-be wife. As a man, I'm looking at him like, wow, I have, like, no riz compared to this man. He's composing a movement to a fucking symphony for his woman. And the rest of us are all here. It's just like, yeah, I bought you a flower. I got you some chocolate. He's just like, nah, watch this, lads. Goes off and composes a movement to a symphony. It's like, I yield, sir. I yield to you and your genius. I cannot compete with that. I mean, ladies in chat. Man comes along and he says, yes, I have composed a movement to a symphony for you. Or I have composed an entire symphony or a concerto or just, a piece of classical music for you. Strikes up the orchestra and just plays it, or he's already recorded and everything. What do we think? Giga Chad move, mega based. What do we think? Man does that for you. Are you? I mean, I would think that is like so Giga Chad. It's like, excuse me while I take off my clothes for you.
Scored for just harp and strings, this music is famously beautiful, and yet it is not the same kind of love as his third symphony. There is something sad, something vulnerable, something deeply mature in this music. A kind of subdued but deep welling emotion, which is impossible to describe and yet so perfectly captured by Mahler, which is perhaps why it's become one of his most popular movements. Gustav and Elmer married shortly afterwards in 1902.
Well, I mean, you put all that work. How can you say no to a marriage proposal from Gustav Mahler? It's like, here, darling, I wrote a movement to a symphony for you. You turn them down, you're just going to look like a bitch. You really are.
But Mahler insisted that there could only be one composer in the household, and that her role would be to support him. Although Alma obliged, this demand set the foundations for a difficult relationship. The summer of 1903 was a happy one, spent in their lakeside cottage at the Wörthersee. Gustav, Alma, and their first daughter, Maria. Alma writes, he often played with the child, dragging her all over, taking her in his arms, dancing and singing. He was so young back then and so unencumbered. And yet, Mahler would spend his mornings in his composing hut, working on two dark projects. The first was his Kindertotenlieder, songs on the death of children, settings of poetry by Friedrich Ruckert. Alma writes, I cannot understand how one can sing about the death of children if half an hour before one has hugged and kissed those who are cheerful and healthy. For heaven's sake, don't tempt fate.
Sort of goes back to the whole write the vision, make it plain. When it comes to prophecy. Yeah, this almost sounds like some strange form of like bipolar, bicameral neuroses that he's dealing with. It just, yeah. I mean, he didn't really do it in front of the children, but still, that's a bit disturbing. That, it's like you're so happy one minute, and then all of a sudden, you're in your shed and you're writing music about the death of children. That, I'd have to wonder if Mahler didn't have some form of bipolar disorder.
The other project was his sixth symphony, which Mahler himself called the Tragic Symphony. He would play this music to Alma on the piano.
Spoiler alert.
In the third movement, he describes the arrhythmic playing of two children staggering through the sand. Horrible. These children's voices become more and more tragic, and at the end there is one little voice whimpering. And then in the final movement of the tragic symphony, we hear the downfall of the hero, signified by the giant strikes of a hammer. As Mahler says, this hero receives 3 blows from fate, the third of which fells him like a tree. After showing the music to Alma, she says, "We both cried. We felt so deeply what this music meant."
Well, yeah, I mean, damn, that is depressing. But then again, that's, I don't know. Many great troubled artists. This is but a fraction of what they go through in their mind.
Well, that symphony wouldn't be performed for another few years. And actually, these next few years were some of Mahler's happiest. In 1904, Gustav and Alma did have a second child, Anna Mahler. And that same year, he wrote his strange 7th symphony. And then in 1906, Gustav had an extraordinary summer of productivity. Every summer, he would go to his lake cottage for a few months and focus purely on composing. But this summer, he had a stroke of intense inspiration. A vision that struck me by lightning. I only had to write it down, as if it had been dictated to me. Within only a few weeks, Mahler composed one of the largest scale symphonies that has ever been written, his 8th symphony. This is a symphony for orchestra, organ, double chorus, children's chorus, 8 vocal soloists, plus a series of eclectic instruments.
Yes, we're going to need 8 Pavarottis for this one, chat. That's what it's going to take. And then all of these other odd instruments. It calls it Symphony of the Thousand, but probably a more apt description would be Symphony of the Kitchen Sink, because it seems like he threw everything in the kitchen sink at it.
It quickly became known as the Symphony of 1,000, and that is no exaggeration. The Munich premiere needed 858 singers and 171 instrumentalists.
1,029 musicians! My God!
Mahler described it, "Imagine that the universe begins to sound and ring out. These are no longer human voices."
Yeah, because you practically brought the entire universe in, man!
But rather planets and suns that are circling. The music is filled to the brim with incredible counterpoints, massive climaxes.
He has assembled an orchestra and chorus of a small moon.
Beautiful melodies and prayers of love. It is by far Mahler's most joyful symphony, and it's also another philosophical one. It's split into 2 movements. The first is set to a Latin prayer, Veni Creator Spiritus, and the second movement is set to the closing scenes of Goethe's Faust, where Faust is redeemed through love and through this idea of the eternal womanhood. What links this prayer and this text? The idea of a rejoicing kind of love, a love that can redeem mankind. It really is an extraordinary, happy work, which plays out on a universally large scale. If you ever get the chance to hear this live, then go.
Yes,
the 8th would also turn out to be Mahler's most successful work, at least in his lifetime. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. In the same year that he wrote his 8th, the tragic 6th Symphony finally received its premiere. That solemn work with its wailing children and 3 blows of fate. And this first performance affected Mahler like none other. After conducting the performance, he was left totally shocked, sobbing, wringing his hands, and not in control of himself. No work, according to Alma, had touched him so much at the first hearing.
There are some people that they hear a great work of classical music and that's how it leaves them. They're just, they're just completely not in control of themselves. They have just been so emotionally moved by what they have just seen and heard that they have forgotten themselves. It's the same thing with opera. And it can be rather polarizing. There's some people that, they may have no knowledge, training, or anything like that in classical music or the opera, but they have a rather polarizing reaction to, or polarized rather, reaction to what it is that they are seeing and hearing. That they either love it or they hate it. Now, those that love it, they will always love it. That love is always there. If they hate it, well, they may learn to like it, but it will never become an intimate part of their soul like those who love it. Yo, narrator voice. Rock Eater, welcome in. Also interesting that Mahler's symphonic works, his symphonies, have premiered out of order, which I suppose is rather commonplace. Sometimes you finish up a symphony maybe a bit earlier or later than others. It's not a linear pathway. So it's something interesting that I've noticed about the works of Mahler.
And then, as if by prophetic fate, within one single summer, Mahler suffered 3 hammer blows to his own life. In the summer of 1907, he was driven out of his dream job in Vienna due to a hate campaign against him. Shortly afterwards, his 2 daughters became seriously ill with scarlet fever and diphtheria. After battling with this for 2 weeks, Maria, his eldest daughter, died from her sickness. Mahler's dark songs were coming true. And then, almost...
He had prophesied his own future. Why are you teaching us life lessons? Why not? I mean, if you wanted something else out of me as a content creator, you can go get that from just about anyone else. This is something that not many other people are talking about as VTubers, as content creators, so why not do something different?
Immediately after this, Mahler discovered that his heart was defective, with a condition that Elmer called a virtual death sentence, the final hammer blow which would fell Mahler like a tree. This was a sea change in Mahler's life, the beginning of the end. Mahler began to work on a 9th symphony, except superstition had now crept into his life in a very real way. He started to believe in what he called the curse of the 9th. He noticed that many of the greatest symphonists since Beethoven had never made it past their 9th symphony. Beethoven, Schubert, Bruckner, Dvorak, all had died after their 9th symphonies.
That's quite true. There is no 10th symphony of Beethoven. He had the 9th symphony, and that was considered his magnum opus. And he died shortly thereafter. He was, by that time, not a well man. And most of us may be familiar with the fact that Beethoven had quite terrible hearing problems. He was quite hard of hearing. By the time he conducted the orchestra for his 9th symphony, he was completely and totally deaf. He could not hear the very orchestra that he was conducting. And at one point he was actually out of sync with the orchestra and still conducting, even though they had played the last notes. And someone had to come up to the stage and sort of tap him on the shoulder to let him know, Maestro, you're finished. You can stop conducting now. And if you'll turn around, you'll see that, it was a hit. Everyone loved it.
And so, instead of writing a real Ninth Symphony, Gustav tried to trick fate by creating a ghost symphony, a symphonic song cycle set to texts based on ancient Chinese poetry called Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. Even here, though, Mahler's thoughts were clearly troubled. He set songs such as the drinking song of Earth's sorrow, the solitary one in autumn, and the final song, Der Abschied, the farewell. We can see how Gustav might have resonated with this text. Fortune was not kind to me in this world. Where do I go? I wander in the mountains. I seek peace for my lonely heart. Mahler spent these late years wandering himself, with disparate conducting work between Europe and the United States. And in this period of wandering, he finally set to work on his real Ninth Symphony.
You cannot trick fate like that. That is not how that works. Yes, experiencing it, that person truly values it. Yes.
This ninth has become recognized as a farewell to all that he had loved, and a farewell to the world.
Swan
it's a
song.
Farewell to his own life, but also to music. The first movement starts with a strange rhythm, the palpitations of a faltering heart, and then a tender melody. Leonard Bernstein calls this movement a farewell to tonality, a reluctant letting go of the old Austrian way of music. And when you listen to this symphony, it's almost as if Mahler knew that this was the end of the line. Not only the end of his own life, but that he was the last of a Germanic symphonic lineage, one that had begun with Haydn and Mozart. It was the end of the Romantics, and it was all...
It's, that's sad too, because if I remember right, all of Mahler's children died, so he had no heirs, that is quite sad. Beethoven was the best, not gonna lie. Honestly, he was one of the titans. I would definitely put him up there, like top 3, top 2, but maybe tied for first with others.
Also the end of Austria, or at least Austria as he knew it. Within a few years, Europe would pass a point of no return, and the world that Mahler knew would die with it. The final movement of the ninth is particularly personal, as Bernstein...
And it would die so needlessly. In a world war that did not need to happen. And a second one after that. That was nothing, it was really a knock-on effect. The flower of their youth. Generations of people with so much potential. Lost. To pointless wars.
Bernstein says Mahler ties things up not in a pretty bow, but in a fearful knot made out of his own nerves and sinews. We hear prayers, chorales, hymn tunes, and folk songs. The music rises in intense prayer, hoping desperately, but this prayer is given no answer. Instead, these desperate pleas are followed by moments of quiet, Zen-like acceptance. One lone man staring into the void of his own mortality.
I have to wonder if there's some sort of commonality to be had with the book of Job. You know, Job's talk of what I feared most has come to pass. And yet the quiet acceptance, almost an echo of, still I shall believe and trust in the Lord.
Mahler reaches out again with desperate intensity, but the music fails. It fades away at a terrifyingly slow pace, dying slowly into nothingness. And then silence. It is finished. As Bernstein says, never has music come so close to death. And yet, Mahler still had some strength left. In spite of his weakening heart, he continued to conduct concerts in Europe and New York, although his first season with the New York Philharmonic was a financial failure. And then, just before the premiere of his 8th Symphony, the one great symphonic success of his lifetime, Mahler discovered that his wife, Alma, was having an affair with a young architect, Walter Gropius. Mahler was devastated, but he continued to work, now on a 10th Symphony, another intensely personal work. The first movement culminates in these chords of white-hot pain. And across the manuscript, he wrote the words, "You alone know what it means. Farewell, farewell, farewell. To live for you, to die for you. Almschi." Mahler was unable to complete that symphony. For him, the curse of the 9th was real, a barrier beyond which he could not pass without losing his life. He died in May 1911 in Vienna from a disease related to his heart. While his music enjoyed some performances after his death, it was banned during the Nazi era and fell into relative neglect. It's thanks to the efforts of conductors such as Bernstein, Barbarolli and Stokowski that we are more familiar with Mahler today, and that
truly great conductors, all three of them, especially these two. Barbarelli, I will admit I have not listened to a lot of the works that he has conducted, but Bernstein and Stokowski, absolutely amazing men, incredible artists in their own right. And it's thanks to a lot of their intrepid works that the art form that is classical music survives to this day because of their efforts. God bless them both. Just saying, if there were no world wars, we wouldn't develop Earth so fast. You know, I suppose there's a bit of a point in that, Rock Eater. It's like, I forget who it was. Perhaps it was Lenin who once said that sometimes years or decades can happen in a matter of days. In other words, trying to say that history tends to move in fits and starts.
He now regularly fills concert halls. As Mahler said, "Would that I could perform my symphonies for the first time 50 years after my death. Perhaps then they would be popular and beloved." This is yet another Mahlerian prophecy that thankfully has come true.
Indeed. And humanity is better for it. We are better for having this music in our lives, and having this as part of public knowledge. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you have any thoughts, questions, or ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. You can also follow me on Twitter @LordRexworth for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Ko-fi or Throne pages. Links are in the description. Finally, be sure to visit LordRexworth.com and follow me across all platforms. That's LordRexworth.com. Until next time, I wish you all the best, and God bless.